The crisp autumn evening air filled the car as Agent Wilson drove down the empty suburban streets, her mind still processing the classified briefing she'd attended earlier. After 15 years in the CIA, these late-night drives had become routine, but something felt different tonight. The streetlights cast long shadows across her government-issued vehicle as she carefully maintained the speed limit, well aware of how often black women like herself faced unnecessary scrutiny on these roads. Her phone buzzed with a message from headquarters, another developing situation that required her expertise in counterintelligence. She'd answer once she got home. The clock on her dashboard read 11:42 p.m. when red and blue lights suddenly flooded her rearview mirror. Her heart rate picked up slightly, not from fear, but from years of experience telling her this might not be a simple traffic stop. She followed protocol perfectly, turning on the interior lights, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel, and waiting patiently. Through her side mirror, she watched the officer approach, his hand already resting on his weapon. Something about his stance made her instincts fire warning signals. This wasn't standard procedure. License and registration, the officer demanded, his flashlight beam deliberately aimed at her eyes. Agent Wilson maintained her professional composure, developed through countless high-pressure situations across 4 continents. "Of course, officer. My federal credentials are in the glove compartment. Would you like me to retrieve them?" The officer's response came sharp and quick. "Federal credentials? Sure they are. Keep your hands where I can see them." His tone carried that familiar mix of disbelief and authority she'd encountered before, but rarely this aggressive. She began explaining her position calmly. "Sir, I'm a senior intelligence officer with..." But he cut her off mid-sentence. The situation was escalating faster than it should. Through the glare of the flashlight, she noticed his nameplate was conveniently covered, another red flag in an increasingly concerning situation. The next few moments played out like a slow-motion scene. The officer spotted her secure communications equipment on the passenger seat, standard issue for her position but suspicious to uninformed eyes. His hand tightened on his weapon, and she heard him calling for backup on his radio, describing a suspicious vehicle with possible contraband. Agent Wilson took slow, steady breaths, her mind already documenting every detail of this interaction. The wind rustled through nearby trees, carrying distant sirens that grew louder with each passing second. She'd handled delicate negotiations in foreign territories, decoded complex intelligence patterns, but this situation carried its own unique dangers. She thought about her teenage daughter at home, probably still awake studying for tomorrow's chemistry test. She thought about her team at Langley, who would soon notice her missed check-in. Most importantly, she thought about the classified information in her possession and the protocols she needed to protect. More patrol cars arrived, their lights painting the residential street in a carnival of red and blue. The original officer's demeanor grew more confident with backup present. "Step out of the vehicle," he commanded, now flanked by 2 additional officers. Agent Wilson's mind raced through her options. She could see curious neighbors peeking through their windows at the commotion. This situation was quickly becoming more than a simple traffic stop. It was turning into a moment that would have ripple effects far beyond this quiet suburban street. As she carefully complied with the officer's instructions, she made a silent promise to herself. This incident wouldn't just become another statistic or forgotten complaint. She would turn this moment into something meaningful, something that would help prevent others from facing the same treatment. But first, she had to navigate the next few hours with the same tactical precision she'd used throughout her career. The cool metal of handcuffs clicked around her wrists, but her dignity remained intact. She held her head high, knowing that what happened next would depend largely on how she handled these crucial moments. Years of training had taught her that sometimes the biggest victories come from the most challenging situations. Tonight was about to prove that lesson true in ways she never expected. The police station's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Agent Wilson stood firmly at the booking desk, their CIA credentials lying ignored on the counter. The night shift supervisor peered at them with obvious skepticism, as if authentic federal identification was somehow less believable than their assumption of wrongdoing. "These could be fake," the supervisor declared, picking up her credentials with barely concealed disdain. "We get all sorts trying to pass off fancy-looking IDs." His dismissive tone made it clear that by all sorts, he meant people who looked like her. Agent Wilson kept her voice steady, drawing on years of hostage negotiation training. "You can verify my credentials by contacting the Federal Liaison Office. I can provide you with the direct number." She watched as they exchanged glances, their body language revealing their predetermined decision to ignore protocol. The booking officer continued typing into his computer, deliberately slow, while asking questions they already had answers to. Behind her, she could hear the original arresting officer describing the suspicious equipment found in her car to his colleagues. The same standard-issue secure communication devices that every field agent carried had somehow become evidence of potential criminal activity. "Look what else we found," another officer announced, walking in with her briefcase. Her heart rate quickened. That briefcase contained classified documents from tonight's briefing. "This needs to remain sealed," she stated firmly. "It contains federal intelligence materials. Opening it without proper clearance is a violation of national security protocols." Their response was laughter. The kind of laughter that comes from people who think they've caught someone in a lie rather than realizing they're making a serious mistake. "National security, huh?" The supervisor smirked. "Like in the movies." Agent Wilson watched as they placed her briefcase on a nearby desk, knowing she needed to act quickly but strategically. "Before you open that," she said calmly, "I should inform you that tampering with classified materials is a federal offense carrying a minimum 10-year sentence. Each person involved in breaking those seals would be individually liable." Her words finally caused them to pause. She could see the uncertainty creeping into their expressions. 15 years of reading body language in high-stakes situations told her this was her moment to push back. Additionally, she continued, her voice carrying the weight of authority she'd earned through years of service, "My missed check-in has already triggered protocols at Langley. Federal agents are likely en route as we speak. How do you want this situation to end?" The room grew quieter as her words sank in. The younger officers glanced nervously at their supervisor, whose confident demeanor had started to crack. They all knew about federal jurisdiction, but somehow their initial assumptions about her had made them forget standard procedure. Through the station's windows, she could see more patrol cars arriving. Word had spread about their big catch, the supposed impersonator with elaborate fake credentials. Little did they know they were creating exactly the kind of jurisdictional incident that would draw serious federal attention. Her thoughts drifted to similar incidents she'd heard about from other black federal agents. The unnecessary escalations, the ignored credentials, the assumptions of guilt. But unlike many of those cases, she had the full weight of the CIA behind her. This wouldn't end with a simple apology and a dismissive wave. The supervisor's radio crackled to life. "Chief wants to know what's going on with the federal ID." A voice questioned. The supervisor's face tightened as he realized the situation was growing beyond his control. More senior officers were getting involved, asking questions he didn't have good answers for. Agent Wilson stood silently, her posture relaxed but dignified. She'd faced down foreign operatives and navigated international crises. This small-town power play would end exactly as she knew it would, with embarrassed local officers trying to explain their actions to increasingly unhappy federal authorities. The next hour would prove crucial. Either they would come to their senses and follow proper procedure, or they would continue down this path and face the consequences. Either way, she knew this incident would become more than just another example of profiling. It would become a catalyst for change, even if these officers didn't realize it yet. The holding cell was cold, deliberately so, Agent Wilson suspected. A basic intimidation tactic she'd seen used in countless interrogations, though usually from the other side of the bars. The thin metal bench offered no comfort, but she sat with perfect posture, her training kicking in automatically. Time moved slowly in the cramped space, but her mind stayed sharp, cataloging every detail. The clock on the wall had stopped at 3:17, though she couldn't tell if that was AM or PM. The camera in the corner had a blinking red light, but was positioned at an angle that suggested it was more for show than surveillance. These details mattered, they always did. 2 officers walked past her cell for the 3rd time in what she estimated to be 20 minutes. Their casual glances weren't casual at all. They were waiting for her to break character, to show signs that her credentials were fake. She almost smiled at the irony. They'd given her exactly what she needed, time to think and observe. Her thoughts drifted to a similar cell she'd seen in Baghdad years ago, though that one had been part of an actual interrogation facility. The parallel struck her: how people with a little authority often followed the same patterns, whether in a war zone or a suburban police station. The sound of a door opening echoed down the corridor. Heavy footsteps approached, multiple people trying to walk quietly but failing. Agent Wilson recognized the attempted intimidation in their timing. 3 hours of isolation followed by a coordinated approach. It was entry-level psychological pressure, and she'd written papers on far more sophisticated techniques. Ready to tell us the truth? The question came from a detective who hadn't been present during her arrest. His suit was pressed, his badge prominently displayed, clearly called in for what they thought was a major case. Behind him stood the original arresting officer, looking less certain than before. Agent Wilson's response was measured, her voice carrying the same tone she'd used during international negotiations. "The truth has been available to you since my arrest. My credentials are authentic. The classified materials in my possession are time-sensitive. And every minute you continue this detention, you're creating a bigger problem for yourselves." She watched their reactions carefully. The detective maintained his skeptical expression, but the officer behind him shifted uncomfortably. They were starting to realize that someone confident enough to predict federal intervention might actually have the authority to cause it. A young officer hurried up to the detective, whispering something that made his face tighten. Agent Wilson knew that look. It was the same one she'd seen on foreign officials when they realized they'd miscalculated. Her missed check-in would have triggered multiple protocols by now. The CIA didn't lose track of its agents, especially not ones carrying classified materials. The holding cell's dim light cast shadows across the detective's face as he processed this new information. His next words came out less confident. "We've received a call from someone claiming to be a federal official. They're requesting your immediate release." "Claiming to be?" Agent Wilson repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "I imagine they provided proper verification codes. The same ones I offered to give you 3 hours ago." The silence that followed confirmed her assumption. The bureaucratic wheels were turning, and the local authorities were realizing they'd stepped into something much bigger than they'd anticipated. More footsteps echoed down the corridor, faster this time. Urgent voices carried from the front desk. Through the small window in her cell, she caught glimpses of suits moving with purpose, the kind of purpose that came with federal authority. The cavalry had arrived, right on schedule. The detective's radio crackled with a message she couldn't quite hear, but his reaction told her everything. The color drained from his face as he finally understood the full scope of their mistake. This wasn't just about one wrongfully detained person anymore. This had become a major jurisdictional incident, one that would have repercussions far beyond this small station. Agent Wilson remained seated, her posture unchanged. She'd spent the last 3 hours memorizing faces, noting procedural violations, and observing patterns of behavior. This wasn't just about her getting out anymore. It was about ensuring this kind of incident wouldn't happen again. Sometimes the best intelligence work happened in the most unexpected places, and tonight this holding cell had given her exactly what she needed to push for real change. The atmosphere in the police station shifted dramatically as 3 federal vehicles pulled into the parking lot. Through the station's windows, Agent Wilson watched dark suits emerge with purposeful strides. The local officers scrambled to look busy, suddenly very interested in their paperwork. The night shift's bravado evaporated like morning dew under a hot sun. The station doors swung open with authority. Leading the group was Deputy Director Chen, her mentor of 10 years, accompanied by 2 senior field agents and a federal attorney. Their presence transformed the small-town police station into something entirely different, a place where local authority met federal power head-on. "Where is she?" Chen's voice cut through the awkward silence. No pleasantries, no bureaucratic small talk. The desk sergeant pointed toward the holding cells, his earlier confidence replaced by visible nervousness. The sound of multiple dress shoes on linoleum echoed through the corridors. Agent Wilson stood as they approached, her composure unbroken despite the hours of detention. The detective who had questioned her earlier now stood to the side, his body language screaming discomfort. He hadn't expected this level of response. Few did until they experienced it firsthand. "Aren't you okay?" Chen asked, her eyes scanning for any signs of mistreatment. The concern in her voice was genuine, a reminder that behind the federal authority was a human connection forged through years of working together. "I'm fine," Agent Wilson responded, watching as the federal attorney began documenting violations on his tablet. "Though I believe my briefcase containing classified materials has been tampered with," she gestured toward the evidence room, where her belongings had been carelessly stored. Ken's expression hardened. "Get that briefcase, now." Her command sent 2 local officers practically running toward the evidence room. The station captain, finally emerging from his office, tried to assert some control over the situation. "We were following standard procedure for suspicious," he began, but Chen cut him off with a raised hand. "Standard procedure?" The federal attorney stepped forward, his tablet displaying a lengthy list. "Let's discuss your procedures." Ignoring federal credentials. Attempting to access classified materials. Denying multiple requests for federal verification. Shall I continue? The local officers' faces showed a mix of emotions: embarrassment, defensiveness, and growing realization of the trouble they'd created. Agent Wilson observed it all, mentally noting each reaction. This moment would become crucial in her future efforts to bridge the gap between federal and local law enforcement. "We'll need all body camera footage, surveillance recordings, and written reports," Chen continued, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And we'll be conducting interviews with every officer involved in this incident." The station captain's face paled. "Interviews?" "Yes," the federal attorney confirmed. "This incident raises serious questions about your department's handling of federal agents, particularly agents of color. The pattern of behavior displayed tonight suggests a deeper issue that needs addressing." Agent Wilson watched as her belongings were returned, each item carefully documented by one of the federal agents. The classified briefcase remained sealed. Someone had apparently thought better of forcing it open. Small mercies, she thought. As they prepared to leave, Chen paused to address the room. "This incident will have consequences. Not just disciplinary actions, but structural changes in how your department interacts with federal agents. We'll be in touch." Walking out of the station, Agent Wilson felt the cool night air on her face. The same streets that had witnessed her unjust detention now saw her departure with full federal backing. But something had changed inside her during those hours in the cell. "I want to turn this into something productive," she told Chen as they walked to the cars. "These incidents keep happening because there's a disconnect between local and federal law enforcement. We need to bridge that gap." Chen nodded, understanding in her eyes. "You're thinking about training programs?" "More than that," Agent Wilson replied, her mind already formulating plans. "We need systematic change. And this incident just gave us the leverage to make it happen." As they drove away from the station, red and blue lights still reflecting in the rearview mirror, Agent Wilson knew this night would mark the beginning of something important. Sometimes the worst experiences created the best opportunities for change, and she was ready to be that change agent. 2 weeks after the incident, Agent Wilson sat in her home office, surrounded by stacks of reports and statistics. Her laptop displayed dozens of similar cases, federal agents, particularly those of color, facing unnecessary confrontations with local law enforcement. Her detention hadn't been an isolated incident, it was part of a larger pattern that needed addressing. The morning sun streamed through her window as she reviewed body camera footage from that night. Each viewing revealed new details: the officer's immediate assumptions, the dismissal of her credentials, the casual disregard for federal protocols. But she wasn't watching to relive the experience. She was building a case for change. Her phone buzzed with a message from Deputy Director Chen: "Meeting approved. Full board hearing next week." A small victory, but an important one. The agency had agreed to hear her proposal for a new training initiative. Her experience would become more than just another complaint filed away in some dusty archive. Her daughter peeked into the office, bringing her a fresh cup of coffee. "Mom, are you still working on that presentation?" The concern in her voice was touching. Since that night, their conversations had grown deeper, more meaningful. They discussed what it meant to stand up for change, how sometimes difficult experiences could lead to important opportunities. "Almost done," Agent Wilson replied, taking a sip of coffee. "You know what's interesting? The same officers who detained me, they've reached out. They want to be part of the solution. It was true. Several of the younger officers had contacted her through official channels, expressing their desire to learn, to do better. She turned to her presentation slides. The title read, Building Bridges, Improving Federal-Local Law Enforcement Relations. Below it were photos from successful joint operations, examples of proper credential verification, and statistics showing how improved cooperation led to better outcomes for everyone. Her phone rang. Another federal agent who'd faced similar situations wanted to share their story. These calls had become frequent since word of her initiative spread. Each one added another piece to the puzzle, another voice to the chorus calling for change. The afternoon brought a video call with local police academy instructors. Their initial defensiveness had given way to genuine interest in her proposals. "We never had proper training for federal interaction," one admitted. "We've been working blind, relying on outdated procedures." As she outlined her training program, she could see the light of understanding in their eyes. It wasn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It was about building a better system, one that protected both federal agents and local officers while serving their communities more effectively. Later that evening, reviewing her notes, she found the incident report from that night. The official document was cold, clinical, so different from the reality she'd experienced. But attached to it was something unexpected. A letter from the young officer who'd first spotted her credentials, expressing remorse and a commitment to change. Her laptop chimed with an email from the police chief himself. The subject line read, Proposal for Joint Training Initiative. They wanted to be the first department to implement her new program. The same station that had detained her now wanted to lead the way in reform. Sometimes change came from unexpected places. Her daughter brought her dinner, refusing to leave until she took a break. As they sat together, she shared her progress. "You know, sweetheart, sometimes the hardest moments in life give us the best opportunities to make a difference." Her daughter nodded, understanding beyond her years. The next morning would bring more meetings, more presentations, more steps toward meaningful change. But tonight, looking at the growing support for her initiative, Agent Wilson felt a deep sense of purpose. Her ordeal was transforming into something positive, something that would help others avoid similar experiences. She made one final note in her journal. Change doesn't come from anger or revenge. It comes from turning difficult experiences into opportunities for growth. The words rang true, not just for her situation, but for anyone working to improve broken systems. 6 months after the detention incident, the police training center buzzed with activity. Agent Wilson stood at the front of the room, watching as federal agents and local officers worked side by side in training exercises. The scene before her was proof that change wasn't just possible, it was happening. "Remember," she called out to the group, "credentials have specific security features." She held up a sample ID, pointing out the holographic elements and specialized watermarks. The local officers leaned forward, genuinely interested. These weren't the same people who'd dismissed her credentials that night, or rather, they were, but they changed. A young officer raised his hand. "What if we're unsure about authenticity?" The question showed how far they'd come. Instead of making assumptions, they were learning to ask the right questions. "That's exactly why we created the verification hotline," Agent Wilson responded, displaying the new 24-hour federal verification system on the screen. "One call, 3 minutes, complete certainty." The system had already prevented several potential incidents since its implementation. During the lunch break, she overheard conversations between federal and local officers. They shared stories, compared experiences, broke down the invisible barriers that had contributed to so many misunderstandings. A senior local officer admitted to her, "We were operating on outdated assumptions. This program opened our eyes." The afternoon session focused on racial sensitivity and bias recognition. Agent Wilson watched as officers engaged in honest discussions about their preconceptions and learned practical steps to overcome them. The atmosphere was different from typical diversity training. This was real, raw, and relevant to their daily work. "Let's run through another scenario," she announced, setting up a role-play situation. Night traffic stop, federal agent, miscommunication. The officers split into groups, applying their new knowledge. She noticed how they caught themselves when old habits surfaced, actively working to implement better approaches. The police chief, who'd initially been skeptical of such comprehensive changes, now sat in on every session. This isn't just changing procedures, he told her during a break. It's changing mindsets. His department had become a model for others, with requests for similar training programs coming in from across the country. Later that day, she received an email from the FBI Training Division. They wanted to incorporate elements of her program into their standard protocols. What had started as a response to her own experience was growing into something much bigger. A group of officers stayed after the session, sharing their own experiences with federal interactions. One confessed, "We never realized how our assumptions could escalate situations unnecessarily." Their honesty was refreshing. These weren't just participants in a mandatory training, they were partners in creating lasting change. Back in her office, Agent Wilson reviewed the program's impact statistics. Incidents of credential-related detentions had dropped significantly. More importantly, communication between federal and local agencies had improved across the board. Real change was happening, one training session at a time. Her phone lit up with a message from Deputy Director Chen, program approved for national rollout. The news brought a smile to her face. What had started as a personal ordeal was now transforming law enforcement relationships across the country. As she packed up her materials, a rookie officer approached her. "Your story changed how I approach every traffic stop now," he said quietly. "Thank you for turning your experience into something that helps us do our jobs better." That evening, driving home along the same streets where her ordeal had begun, Agent Wilson reflected on the journey. The incident that could have left her bitter had instead become a catalyst for positive change. Sometimes the best reforms came from those who had the most reason to be angry, but chose to be constructive instead. 2 years had passed since that fateful traffic stop. Agent Wilson stood at the podium of the National Law Enforcement Conference, looking out at a sea of faces, federal agents and local officers alike. Her training program had evolved into a nationwide movement, changing how law enforcement agencies worked together across America. "We've trained over 10,000 officers," she announced, clicking to the next slide. But numbers don't tell the whole story. The real success lies in the incidents that never happened, the confrontations that were prevented, and the bridges we've built between agencies. The audience nodded in understanding. Many had been through her program, experiencing firsthand how it transformed their approach to inter-agency interactions. A local officer raised her hand during the Q&A session. "Your program saved my career last month," she shared. "I'd almost made the same mistakes your arresting officers did, but then I remembered your training." During the break, Agent Wilson walked through the conference hall, stopping at various displays showcasing successful joint operations between federal and local agencies. Her daughter, now in college studying criminal justice, stood proudly beside her. "Mom, look how many people you've helped," she whispered, pointing to the impact statistics. The afternoon panel discussion focused on real-world results. Police chiefs from across the country shared stories of improved cooperation, reduced tensions, and better community relations. One chief admitted, "We used to see federal agents as outsiders. Now they're partners in keeping our communities safe." Back in her office at CIA headquarters, Agent Wilson reviewed the latest data. Incidents of wrongful detention of federal agents had dropped by 85% nationwide. But more importantly, communication channels between agencies had opened up, creating a network of mutual support and understanding. Her phone buzzed with a message from the officer who'd originally detained her. He'd risen through the ranks to become a training coordinator, dedicated to teaching new officers the lessons he'd learned. "Your experience changed my entire approach to law enforcement," his message read. "Thank you for showing us a better way." The wall of her office displayed framed testimonials from officers whose careers had been positively impacted by the program. Each letter represented a mind changed, a perspective shifted, a potential incident prevented. But her favorite was a simple note from a young black female FBI agent. "Because of your work, I've never had to experience what you did." Later that evening, she attended a graduation ceremony for the latest class of police academy recruits. These officers had gone through her enhanced training program as part of their basic curriculum. Watching them take their oaths, she knew they were better prepared to serve their communities with understanding and respect. Her phone lit up again. The White House was calling. They wanted to discuss implementing her program at a federal level, making it mandatory for all law enforcement agencies. What had started as a response to personal injustice had grown into a catalyst for nationwide reform. As she drove home that night, a police car pulled up behind her. But this time, there was no anxiety, no tension. The officer recognized her federal credentials immediately, following the protocols her program had established. A simple professional interaction, exactly how it should be. Her daughter called as she walked through her front door. "Mom, guess what? My criminal justice professor used your case study today. You're literally changing how the next generation of officers thinks about law enforcement." That night, looking through her old journal entries from 2 years ago, Agent Wilson found her original notes from the detention. The anger and frustration had transformed into something powerful, a force for positive change that would outlast her career and impact generations to come. Sometimes, she realized, the most significant changes start with one person refusing to let a bad experience be the end of the story.